Chapter 6 of Far from the Madding Crowd. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tadhg Hynes. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 6. The Fair, the Journey, the Fire. 2 months passed away. We are brought on to a day in February on which is held the yearly statute or hiring fair in the county town of Casterbridge. At one end of the street stood from 200 to 300 blithe and hearty labourers waiting upon chance, all men of the stamp to whom labour suggests nothing worse than a wrestle with gravitation, and pleasure nothing better than a renunciation of the same. Among these, carters and waggoners were distinguished by having a piece of whipcord twisted round their hats. Thatchers wore a fragment of woven straw. Shepherds held their sheep crooks in their hands, and thus the situation required was known to the hirers at a glance. In the crowd was an athletic young fellow of somewhat superior appearance to the rest. In fact, his superiority was marked enough to lead several ruddy peasants standing by to speak to him inquiringly, as to a farmer, and to use "sir" as a finishing word. His answer always was, "I am looking for a place myself, a bailiff's. Do you know of anybody who wants one?" Gabriel was paler now. His eyes were more meditative, and his expression was more sad. He had passed through an ordeal of wretchedness which had given him more than it had taken away. He had sunk from his modest elevation as pastoral king into the very slime pits of Siddim. But there was left to him a dignified calm he had never before known, and that indifference to fate which, though it often makes a villain of a man, is the basis of his sublimity when it does not. And thus the abasement had been exaltation, and the loss gain. In the morning a regiment of cavalry had left the town, and a sergeant and his party had been beating up for recruits through the 4 streets. As the end of the day drew on and he found himself not hired, Gabriel almost wished that he had joined them and gone off to serve his country. Weary of standing in the market-place and not much minding the kind of work he turned his hand to, he decided to offer himself in some other capacity than that of bailiff. All the farmers seemed to be wanting shepherds. Sheep-tending was Gabriel's speciality. Turning down an obscure street and entering an obscurer lane, he went up to a smith's shop. "How long would it take you to make a shepherd's crook?" "20 minutes." "How much?" "2 shillings." He sat on a bench, and the crook was made, a stem being given him into the bargain. He then went to a ready-made clothes shop, the owner of which had a large rural connection. As the crook had absorbed most of Gabriel's money, he attempted, and carried out, an exchange of his overcoat for a shepherd's regulation smock frock. This transaction having been completed, he again hurried off to the centre of the town, and stood on the curb of the pavement as a shepherd, crook in hand. Now that Oak had turned himself into a shepherd, it seemed that bailiffs were most in demand. However, 2 or 3 farmers noticed him and drew near. Dialogues followed, more or less in the subjoined form. "Where do you come from?" "Norcombe." "That's a long way." "15 miles." "Whose farm were you upon last?" "My own." This reply invariably operated like a rumour of cholera. The inquiring farmer would edge away and shake his head dubiously. Gabriel, like his dog, was too good to be trustworthy, and he never made advance beyond this point. It is safer to accept any chance that offers itself, and extemporize a procedure to fit it, than to get a good plan matured and wait for a chance of using it. Gabriel wished he had not nailed up his colours as a shepherd, but had laid himself out for anything in the whole cycle of labour that was required in the fair. It grew dusk. Some merry men were whistling and singing by the corn exchange. Gabriel's hand, which had lain for some time idle in his smock-frock pocket, touched his flute, which he carried there. Here was an opportunity for putting his dearly bought wisdom into practice. He drew out his flute and began to play Jockey to the Fair, in the style of a man who had never known a moment's sorrow. Oak could pipe with Arcadian sweetness, and the sound of the well-known notes cheered his own heart as well as those of the loungers. He played on with spirit, and in half an hour had earned in pence what was a small fortune to a destitute man. By making inquiries he learnt that there was another fair at Shottsford the next day. "How far is Shottsford?" 10 miles t'other side of Weatherbury." Weatherbury. It was where Bathsheba had gone 2 months before. This information was like coming from night into noon. "How far is it to Weatherbury?" "5 or 6 miles." Bathsheba had probably left Weatherbury long before this time, but the place had enough interest attaching to it to lead Oak to choose Shottsford Fair as his next field of inquiry, because it lay in the Weatherbury quarter. Moreover, the Weatherbury folk were by no means uninteresting intrinsically. If report spoke truly, they were as hardy, merry, thriving, wicked a set as any in the whole county. Oak resolved to sleep at Weatherbury that night on his way to Shottsford, and struck out at once into the high road which had been recommended as the direct route to the village in question. The road stretched through water meadows traversed by little brooks, whose quivering surfaces were braided along their centres and folded into creases at the sides, or, where the flow was more rapid, the stream was pied with spots of white froth, which rode on in undisturbed serenity. On the higher levels the dead and dry carcasses of leaves tapped the ground as they bowled along helter-skelter upon the shoulders of the wind, and little birds in the hedges were rustling their feathers and tucking themselves in comfortably for the night, retaining their places if Oak kept moving, but flying away if he stopped to look at them. He passed by Yalbury Wood, where the game birds were rising to their roosts, and heard the crack-voiced cock-pheasant "Kyuk-kyuk," and the wheezy whistles of the hens. By the time he had walked 3 or 4 miles, every shape in the landscape had assumed a uniform hue of blackness. He descended Yalbury Hill, and could just discern ahead of him a waggon, drawn up under a great overhanging tree by the roadside. On coming close he found there were no horses attached to it, the spot being apparently quite deserted. The waggon, from its position, seemed to have been left there for the night, for beyond about half a truss of hay which was heaped in the bottom it was quite empty. Gabriel sat down on the shafts of the vehicle and considered his position. He calculated that he had walked a very fair proportion of the journey, and having been on foot since daybreak he felt tempted to lie down upon the hay in the waggon instead of pushing on to the village of Weatherbury and having to pay for a lodging. Eating his last slices of bread and ham, and drinking from the bottle of cider he had taken the precaution to bring with him, he got into the lonely waggon. Here he spread half of the hay as a bed, and, as well as he could in the darkness, pulled the other half over him by way of bedclothes, covering himself entirely, and feeling physically as comfortable as ever he had been in his life. Inward melancholy it was impossible for a man like Oak, introspective far beyond his neighbours, to banish quite, whilst conning the present untoward page of his history. So, thinking of his misfortunes, amorous and pastoral, he fell asleep, shepherds enjoying, in common with sailors, the privilege of being able to summon the god instead of having to wait for him. On somewhat suddenly awaking, after a sleep of whose length he had no idea, Oak found that the waggon was in motion. He was being carried along the road at a rate rather considerable for a vehicle without springs, and under circumstances of physical uneasiness, his head being dandled up and down on the bed of the waggon like a kettle-drum stick. He then distinguished voices in conversation, coming from the fore part of the waggon. His concern at his dilemma, which would have been alarm had he been a thriving man, but misfortune is a fine opiate to personal terror, led him to peer cautiously from the hay, and the first sight he beheld was the stars above him. Charles's Wain was getting towards a right angle with the pole star, and Gabriel concluded that it must be about 9 o'clock. In other words, that he had slept 2 hours. This small astronomical calculation was made without any positive effort, and whilst he was stealthily turning to discover, if possible, into whose hands he had fallen. 2 figures were dimly visible in front, sitting with their legs outside the waggon, one of whom was driving. Gabriel soon found that this was the waggoner, and it appeared that they had come from Casterbridge fair like himself. A conversation was in progress, which continued thus. "Be as 'twill, she's a fine handsome body as far as looks be concerned, but that's only the skin of the woman, and these dandy cattle be as proud as Lucifer in their insides." "Ay, so it do seem, Bill Smallbury, so it do seem." This utterance was very shaky by nature, and more so by circumstance, the jolting of the waggon not being without its effect upon the speaker's larynx. It came from the man who held the reins. "She's a very vain female, so 'tis said here and there." "Ah, now, If so be 'tis like that I can't look her in the face. Lord, no, not I, such a shy man as I be. Yes, she's very vain. 'Tis said that every night at going to bed she looks in the glass to put on her nightcap properly. And not a married woman, all the world. And I can play the pianner, so 'tis said. Can play so clever that it can make a psalm tune sound as well as the merriest loose song a man can wish for. Do you tell it? A happy time for us, and I feel quite a new man. And how does she pay? Oh, that I don't know, Master Poorgrass. On hearing these and other similar remarks, a wild thought flashed into Gabriel's mind that they might be speaking of Bathsheba. There were, however, no grounds for retaining such a supposition, for the waggon, though going in the direction of Weatherbury, might be going beyond it, and the woman alluded to seemed to be the mistress of some estate. They were now apparently close upon Weatherbury, and not to alarm the speakers unnecessarily, Gabriel slipped out of the waggon unseen. He turned to an opening in the hedge, which he found to be a gate, and mounting thereon, he sat meditating whether to seek a cheap lodging in the village, or to ensure a cheaper one by lying under some hay or corn stack. The crunching jangle of the waggon died upon his ear. He was about to walk on, when he noticed on his left hand an unusual light, appearing about half a mile distant. Oak watched it, and the glow increased. Something was on fire. Gabriel again mounted the gate, and, leaping down on the other side upon what he found to be ploughed soil, made across the field in the exact direction of the fire. The blaze, enlarging in a double ratio by his approach and its own increase, showed him as he drew nearer the outline of ricks beside it, lighted up to great distinctness. A rickyard was the source of the fire. His weary face now began to be painted over with a rich orange glow, and the whole front of his smock frock and gaiters was covered with a dancing shadow pattern of thorn twigs, the light reaching him through a leafless intervening hedge, and the metallic curve of his sheep-crook shone silver bright in the same abounding rays. He came up to the boundary fence, and stood to regain breath. It seemed as if the spot was unoccupied by a living soul. The fire was issuing from a long straw stack, which was so far gone as to preclude a possibility of saving it. A rick burns differently from a house. As the wind blows the fire inwards, the portion in flames completely disappears like melting sugar, and the outline is lost to the eye. However, a hay or wheat rick, well put together, will resist combustion for a length of time, if it begins on the outside. This, before Gabriel's eyes, was a rick of straw, loosely put together, and the flames darted into it with lightning swiftness. It glowed on the windward side, rising and falling in intensity, like the coal of a cigar. Then a superincumbent bundle rolled down with a whisking noise. Flames elongated and bent themselves about with a quiet roar, but no crackle. Banks of smoke went off horizontally at the back like passing clouds, and behind these burned hidden pyres, illuminating the semi-transparent sheet of smoke to a lustrous yellow uniformity. Individual straws in the foreground were consumed in a creeping movement of ruddy heat, as if they were knots of red worms, and above shone imaginary fiery faces, tongues hanging from lips, glaring eyes, and other impish forms, from which at intervals sparks flew in clusters like birds from a nest. Oak suddenly ceased from being a mere spectator by discovering the case to be more serious than he had first imagined. A scroll of smoke blew aside and revealed to him a wheat rick in startling juxtaposition with the decaying one, and behind this a series of others composing the main corn produce of the farm, so that instead of the straw stack standing, as he had imagined, comparatively isolated, there was a regular connection between it and the remaining stacks of the group. Gabriel leapt over the hedge, and saw that he was not alone. The first man he came to was running about in a great hurry, as if his thoughts were several yards in advance of his body, which they could never drag on fast enough. "Oh, man! Fire! Fire! A good master and a bad servant is fire. Fire! I mean a bad servant and a good master. Oh, Mark Clark, come! And you, Billy Smallbury, and you, Mary Ann Money, and you, Jan Coggan, and Matthew there." Other figures now appeared behind this shouting man and among the smoke, and Gabriel found that, far from being alone, he was in a great company, whose shadows danced merrily up and down, timed by the jigging of the flames, and not at all by their owners' movements. The assemblage, belonging to that class of society which casts its thoughts into the form of feeling, and its feelings into the form of commotion, set to work with a remarkable confusion of purpose. "Stop the draught under the wheat rick!" cried Gabriel to those nearest to him. The corn stood on stone straddles, and between these tongues of yellow hue from the burning straw licked and darted playfully. If the fire once got under this stack, all would be lost. "Get a tarpaulin, quick!" said Gabriel. A rick cloth was brought, and they hung it like a curtain across the channel. The flames immediately ceased to go under the bottom of the corn stack, and stood up vertical. "Stand here with a bucket of water, and keep the cloth wet," said Gabriel again. The flames, now driven upward, began to attack the angles of the huge roof covering the wheat stack. "A ladder!" cried Gabriel. "The ladder was against a straw rick and is burnt to a cinder," said a spectre-like form in the smoke. Oak seized the cut ends of the sheaves as if he were going to engage in the operation of reed drawing, and, digging in his feet and occasionally sticking in the stem of his sheep crook, he clambered up the beetling face. He at once sat astride the very apex, and began with his crook to beat off the fiery fragments which had lodged thereon, shouting to the others to get him a bough and a ladder, and some water. Billy Smallbury, one of the men who had been on the waggon, by this time had found a ladder, which Mark Clark ascended, holding on beside Oak upon the thatch. The smoke at this corner was stifling, and Clark, a nimble fellow, having been handed a bucket of water, bathed Oak's face and sprinkled him generally, whilst Gabriel, now with a long beech bough in one hand, in addition to his crook in the other, kept sweeping the stack and dislodging all fiery particles. On the ground the groups of villagers were still occupied in doing all they could to keep down the conflagration, which was not much. They were all tinged orange and backed up by shadows of varying pattern. Round the corner of the largest stack, out of the direct rays of the fire, stood a pony bearing a young woman on its back. By her side was another woman on foot. These two seemed to keep at a distance from the fire, that the horse might not become restive. "He's a shepherd," said the woman on foot. "Yes, he is. See how his crook shines as he beats the rick with it. And his smock frock is burnt in 2 holes, I declare. A fine young shepherd he is too, ma'am." "Whose shepherd is he?" said the equestrian in a clear voice. "I don't know, ma'am." "Don't any of the others know?" "Nobody at all. I've asked them. Quite a stranger, they say." The young woman on the pony rode out from the shade and looked anxiously around. "Do you think the barn is safe?" she said. "Do you think the barn is safe, Jan Coggan?" said the second woman, passing on the question to the nearest man in that direction. "Safe now. Leastwise I think so. If this rick had gone, the barn would have followed. 'Tis that bold shepherd up there that have done the most good. He's sitting on top of that rick, whizzing his great long arms about like a windmill." "He does work hard," said the young woman on horseback, looking up at Gabriel through her thick woollen veil. "I wish he was shepherd here. Don't any of you know his name?" "Never heard the man's name in my life, or seed his form afore." The fire began to get worsted, and Gabriel's elevated position being no longer required of him, he made as if to descend. "Marianne," said the girl on horseback, "go to him as he comes down, and say that the farmer wishes to thank him for the great service he has done." Marianne stalked off towards the rick, and met Oak at the foot of the ladder. She delivered her message. Where is your master, the farmer?" said Gabriel, kindling with the idea of getting employment that seemed to strike him now. "'Tisn't a master, 'tis a mistress shepherd." "A woman farmer?" "Ah, I believe, and a rich one too," said a bystander. "Lately you came here from a distance. Took on her uncle's farm, who died suddenly, and used to measure his money in half-pint cups. They say now that she's business in every bank in Casterbridge, and thinks no more of playing pitch and toss sovereign than you and I do pitch halfpenny. Not a bit in the world, shepherd." "That's she, back up there on the pony," said Maryann, "with her face covered up in that black cloth with holes in it." Oak, his features smudged, grimy, and undiscoverable from the smoke and heat, his smock frock burnt into holes and dripping with water, the ash stem of his sheep crook charred 6 inches shorter, advanced with the humility stern adversity had thrust upon him up to the slight female form in the saddle. He lifted his hat with respect, and not without gallantry. Stepping close to her hanging feet, he said in a hesitating voice, Do you happen to want a shepherd, ma'am?" She lifted the wool veil tied round her face and looked all astonishment. Gabriel and his cold-hearted darling Bathsheba Everdene were face to face. Bathsheba did not speak, and he mechanically repeated in an abashed and sad voice, "Do you want a shepherd, ma'am?" End of chapter 6. Far from the madding crowd. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tadhg Hynes. Far from the madding crowd by Thomas Hardy, chapter 7. Recognition. A timid girl. Bathsheba withdrew into the shade. She scarcely knew whether most to be amused at the singularity of the meeting, or to be concerned at its awkwardness. There was room for a little pity, also for a very little exultation, the former at his position, and the latter at her own. Embarrassed she was not, and she remembered Gabriel's declaration of love to her at Norcombe, only to think she had nearly forgotten it. "Yes," she murmured, putting on an air of dignity, and turning again to him with a little warmth of cheek, "I do want a shepherd, but—" "He's the very man, ma'am," said one of the villagers quietly. Conviction breeds conviction. "Ah, that 'a is," said a second decisively. "The man truly," said a third with heartiness. "He's all there," said number 4 fervidly. "Then will you tell him to speak to the bailiff?" said Bathsheba. All was practical again now. A summer eve and loneliness would have been necessary to give the meeting its proper fullness of romance. The bailiff was pointed out to Gabriel, who, checking the palpitation within his breast at discovering that this Ashtoreth of strange report was only a modification of Venus, the well-known and admired, retired with him to talk over the necessary preliminaries of hiring. The fire before them wasted away. "Men," said Bathsheba, "you shall take a little refreshment after this extra work. Will you come to the house?" "We could knock in a bit and a drop a good deal freer, miss, if so be you'd send it to Warren's Malt House," replied the spokesman. Bathsheba then rode off into the darkness, and the men straggled on to the village in twos and threes, Oak and the bailiff being left by the rick alone. "And now," said the bailiff finally, "all is settled, I think, about your coming, and I'm going home along. Good night to ye, shepherd." "Can you get me a lodging?" inquired Gabriel. "That I can't indeed," he said, moving past Oak as a Christian edges past an offertory plate when he does not mean to contribute. "If you follow on the road till you come to Warren's Malt House, where they are all gone to have their snap of victuals, I dare say some of 'em will tell you of a place. Good night to ye, shepherd." The bailiff, who showed this nervous dread of loving his neighbour as himself, went up the hill, and Oak walked on to the village, still astonished at the rencounter with Bathsheba, glad of his nearness to her, and perplexed at the rapidity with which the unpractised girl of Norcombe had developed into the supervising and cool woman here. But some women only require an emergency to make them fit for one. Obliged to some extent to forego dreaming in order to find the way, he reached the churchyard, and passed round it under the wall, where several ancient trees grew. There was a wide margin of grass along here, and Gabriel's footsteps were deadened by its softness, even at this indurating period of the year. When abreast of a trunk which appeared to be the oldest of the old, he became aware that a figure was standing behind it. Gabriel did not pause in his walk, and in another moment he accidentally kicked a loose stone. The noise was enough to disturb the motionless stranger, who started and assumed a careless position. It was a slim girl, rather thinly clad. "Good night to you," said Gabriel heartily. "Good night," said the girl to Gabriel. The voice was unexpectedly attractive. It was the low and dulcet note suggestive of romance, common in descriptions and rare in experience. "I'll thank you to tell me if I'm in the way for Warren's Malt House," Gabriel resumed, primarily to gain the information, indirectly to get more of the music. "Quite right. It's at the bottom of the hill. And do you know—" The girl hesitated, and then went on again. "Do you know how late they keep open the Buck's Head Inn?" She seemed to be won by Gabriel's heartiness, as Gabriel had been won by her modulations. "I don't know where the Buck's Head is, or anything about it. Do you think of going there to-night?"
"Yes."
The woman again paused. There was no necessity for any continuance of speech, and the fact that she did add more seemed to proceed from an unconscious desire to show unconcern by making a remark, which is noticeable in the ingenuous when they are acting by stealth. "You are not a Weatherbury man," she said, timorously. "I am not. I am the new shepherd, just arrived."
"Only a shepherd, and you seem almost a farmer by your ways."
"No, only a shepherd," Gabriel repeated in a dull cadence of finality. His thoughts were directed to the past, his eyes to the feet of the girl, and for the first time he saw lying there a bundle of some sort. She may have perceived the direction of his face, for she said coaxingly, "You won't say anything in the parish about having seen me here, will you? At least not for a day or two." "I won't if you wish me not to," said Oak.
"Thank you, indeed," the other replied. "I am rather poor, and I don't want people to know anything about me."
Then she was silent and shivered. "You ought to have a cloak on such a cold night," Gabriel observed. "I would advise you to get indoors."
"Oh, no. Would you mind going on and leaving me? I thank you much for what you have told me."
"I will go on," he said, adding hesitatingly, "Since you are not very well off, perhaps you would accept this trifle from me. It's only a shilling, but it's all I have to spare."
"Yes, I will take it," said the stranger gratefully.
She extended her hand, Gabriel his. In feeling for each other's palm in the gloom before the money could be passed, a minute incident occurred which told much. Gabriel's finger alighted on the young woman's wrist. It was beating with a throb of tragic intensity. He had frequently felt the same quick, hard beat in the femoral artery of his lambs when overdriven. It suggested a consumption too great of a vitality which, to judge from her figure and stature, was already too little. "What is the matter?"
"Nothing."
"Ah, but there is."
"No, no, no. Let your having seen me be a secret."
"Very well, I will. Good night again."
"Good night."
The young girl remained motionless by the tree, and Gabriel descended into the village of Weatherbury, or Lower Longpuddle, as it was sometimes called. He fancied that he had felt himself in the penumbra of a very deep sadness when touching that slight and fragile creature, but wisdom lies in moderating mere impressions, and Gabriel endeavoured to think little of this. End of chapter 7. Far from the madding crowd. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tadhg Hynes. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 8. The Malt House, the Chat, News. Warren's Malt House was enclosed by an old wall enwrapped with ivy, and though not much of the exterior was visible at this hour, the character and purposes of the building were clearly enough shown by its outline upon the sky. From the walls an overhanging thatched roof sloped up to a point in the centre, upon which rose a small wooden lantern, fitted with louver boards on all the four sides, and from these openings a mist was dimly perceived to be escaping into the night air. There was no window in front, but a square hole in the door was glazed with a single pane, through which red comfortable rays now stretched out upon the ivied wall in front. Voices were to be heard inside. Oak's hand skimmed the surface of the door with fingers extended to an Elymas the Sorcerer pattern, till he found a leathern strap, which he pulled. This lifted the wooden latch, and the door swung open. The room inside was lighted only by the ruddy glow from the kiln mouth, which shone over the floor with the streaming horizontality of the setting sun, and threw upwards the shadows of all facial irregularities in those assembled around. The stone flag floor was worn into a path from the doorway to the kiln, and into undulations everywhere. A curved settle of unplaned oak stretched along one side, and in a remote corner was a small bed and bedstead, the owner and frequent occupier of which was the maltster. This aged man was now sitting opposite the fire, his frosty white hair and beard overgrowing his gnarled figure like the grey moss and lichen upon a leafless apple tree. He wore breeches and the laced-up shoes called ankle-jacks. He kept his eyes fixed upon the fire. Gabriel's nose was greeted by an atmosphere laden with the sweet smell of new malt. The conversation, which seemed to have been concerning the origin of the fire, immediately ceased, and everyone ocularly criticized him to the degree expressed by contracting the flesh of their foreheads and looking at him with narrowed eyelids, as if he had been a light too strong for their sight. Several exclaimed meditatively, after this operation had been completed, "Ah, 'tis a new shepherd, I believe." "We thought we heard a hand pawing about the door for the bobbin, but weren't sure 'twere not a dead leaf blowed across," said another. "Come in, shepherd. Sure ye be welcome, though we don't know your name." "Gabriel Oak, that's my name, neighbours." The ancient maltster, sitting in the midst, turned at this, his turning being as the turning of a rusty crane. "That's never Gabriel Oak's grandson over at Norcombe, never," he said, as a formula expressive of surprise, which nobody was supposed for a moment to take literally. "My father and my grandfather were old men of the name of Gabriel," said the shepherd placidly. "Thought I knowed the man's face as I seed him on the rick, thought I did. And where be you trading off to now, shepherd?" "I'm thinking of biding here," said Mr. Oak. "Knowed your grandfather for years and years," continued the maltster, the words coming forth of their own accord, as if the momentum previously imparted had been sufficient. "Ah, and did you?" "Knowed your grandmother." "And her too?" "Likewise knowed your father when he was a child. Why, my boy Jacob there and your father were sworn brothers, that they were, sure. Weren't you, Jacob?" "Ah, sure," said his son, a young man about 65, with a semi-bald head and one tooth in the left centre of his upper jaw, which made much of itself by standing prominent like a milestone in a bank. "But 'twas Joe had most to do with him. However, my son William must have knowed the very man afore us, didn't ye, Billy, afore you left Norcombe?" "No, 'twas Andrew," said Jacob's son, Billy, a child of 40 or thereabouts, who manifested the peculiarity of possessing a cheerful soul in a gloomy body, and whose whiskers were assuming a chinchilla shade here and there. "I can mind Andrew," said Oak, "as being a man in the place when I was quite a child." "Ah, and the other day I and my youngest daughter Liddy were over at my grandson's christening," continued Billy. "We were talking about this very family, and 'twas only last purification day in this very world, when the use money is gied away to the second best poor folk, you know, shepherd. And I can mind the day, because they all had to traipse up to the vestry. Yes, this very man's family." "Come, shepherd, and drink. 'Tis gape and swaller with us. A drop of summat, but not of much account," said the maltster, removing from the fire his eyes, which were vermilion red and bleared by gazing into it for so many years. "Take up the God forgive me, Jacob, and see if 'tis warm, Jacob." Jacob stooped to the God forgive me, which was a two-handled tall mug standing in the ashes, cracked and charred with heat. It was rather furred with extraneous matter about the outside, especially in the crevices of the handles, the innermost curves of which may not have seen daylight for several years by reason of this encrustation thereon, formed of ashes accidentally wetted with cider and baked hard. But to the mind of any sensible drinker the cup was no worse for that, being incontestably clean on the inside and about the rim. It may be observed that such a class of mug is called a "God forgive me" in Weatherbury and its vicinity for uncertain reasons, probably because its size makes any given toper feel ashamed of himself when he sees its bottom in drinking it empty. Jacob, on receiving the order to see if the liquor was warm enough, placidly dipped his forefinger into it by way of thermometer, and having pronounced it nearly of the proper degree, raised the cup and very civilly attempted to dust some of the ashes from the bottom with the skirt of his smock-frock, because Shepherd Oak was a stranger. "A clean cup for the shepherd," said the maltster commandingly. "No, not at all," said Gabriel in a reproving tone of considerateness. "I never fuss about dirt in its pure state, and when I know what sort it is." Taking the mug, he drank an inch or more from the depths of its contents, and duly passed it to the next man. "Ah, I wouldn't think of giving such trouble to neighbours and washing up when there's so much work to be done in the world already," continued Oak in a moister tone, after recovering from the stoppage of breath which is occasioned by pulls at large mugs. "A right sensible man," said Jacob. "True, true, it can't be gainsaid," observed a brisk young man, Mark Clark by name, a genial and pleasant gentleman, whom to meet anywhere in your travels was to know was to drink with, and to drink with was, unfortunately, to pay for. And here's a mouthful of bread and bacon that missus have sent, shepherd. The cider'll go down better with a bit of victuals. Don't ye chalk quite close, shepherd, for I let the bacon fall in the road outside as I was bringing it along, and it may be 'tis rather gritty. There, 'tis plain dirt, and we all know what that is, as you say, and you bain't a particular man, we see, shepherd." "True, true, not at all," said the friendly oak. "Don't let your teeth quite meet, and you won't feel the sandiness at all. Ah, 'tis wonderful what can be done by contrivance." "My own mind exactly, neighbour." "Ah, he's as grand for his own grandson. His grandfather were just such a nice unparticular man," said the maltster. "Drink, Henry Fray, drink," magnanimously said Jan Coggan, a person who held Saint Simonian notions of share and share alike where liquor was concerned, as the vessel showed signs of approaching him in its gradual revolution among them. Having at this moment reached the end of a wistful gaze into mid-air, Henry did not refuse. He was a man of more than middle age, with eyebrows high up in his forehead, who laid it down that the law of the world was bad, with a long-suffering look through his listeners at the world alluded to, as it presented itself to his imagination. He always signed his name Henery, strenuously insisting upon that spelling, and if any passing schoolmaster ventured to remark that the second E was superfluous and old-fashioned, he received the reply that Henery was the name he was christened, and the name he would stick to, in the tone of one to whom orthographical differences were matters which had a great deal to do with personal character. Mr. Jan Coggan, who had passed the cup to Henery, was a crimson man with a spacious countenance and private glimmer in his eye, whose name had appeared on the marriage register of Weatherbury and the neighbouring parishes as best man and chief witness in countless unions of the previous 20 years. He also very frequently filled the post of head godfather in baptisms of the subtly jovial kind. "Come, Mark Clark, come, there's plenty more in the barrel," said Jan. "Ah, that I will. 'Tis my only doctor," replied Mr. Clark, who, 20 years younger than Jan Coggan, revolved in the same orbit. He secreted mirth on all occasions for special discharge at popular parties. "Why, Joseph Poorgrass, ye hadn't had a drop," said Mr. Coggan to a self-conscious man in the background, thrusting the cup towards him. "Such a modest man as he is," said Jacob Smallbury. "Why, you've hardly had strength of eye enough to look in our young missus's face, so I hear, Joseph." All looked at Joseph Poorgrass with pitying reproach. "No, I've hardly looked at her at all," simpered Joseph, reducing his body smaller whilst talking, apparently from a meek sense of undue prominence. "And when I seed her, 'twas nothing but blushes with me." "Poor feller," said Mr. Clark. "'Tis a curious nature for a man," said Jan Coggan. "Yes," continued Joseph Poorgrass, his shyness, which was so painful as a defect, filling him with a mild complacency, now that it was regarded as an interesting study. "'Twere blush, blush, blush with me every minute of the time when she was speaking to me." "I believe you, Joseph Poorgrass, for we all know you to be a very bashful man." "'Tis an awkward gift for a man, poor soul," said the maltster. "And how long have you suffered from it, Joseph?" "Oh, ever since I was a boy. Yes, mother was concerned to her heart about it, yes, but 'twas all naught." "Did you ever go into the world and try to stop it, Joseph Poorgrass?" "I tried all sorts of company. They took me to Greenhill Fair, and into a great gay jerry-go-nimble show, where there were women folk riding around, standing upon horses, with hardly anything on but their smocks, but it didn't cure me a morsel. And then I was put errand man at the woman's skittle alley at the back of the Tailor's Arms in Casterbridge. 'Twas a horrible sinful situation, and a very curious place for a good man. I had to stand and look bawdy people in the face from morning till night. But 'twas no use, I was just as bad as ever after all. Blushes have been in the family for generations. There, 'tis a happy providence that I be no worse." "True," said Jacob Smallbury, deepening his thoughts to a profounder view of the subject. "'Tis a thought to look at that ye might have been worse. But even as you be, 'tis a very bad affliction for 'ee, Joseph. For you see, shepherd, though 'tis very well for a woman, dang it all, 'tis awkward for a man like him, poor fella." "Yes, 'tis," said Gabriel, recovering from a meditation. "Yes, very awkward for the man." "Ay, and he's very timid too," observed Jan Coggan. "Once he had been working late at Yalbury Bottom, and had had a drop of drink, and lost his way as he was coming home along through Yalbury Wood. Didn't he, Master Poorgrass?"
"No, no, not that story," expostulated the modest man, forcing a laugh to bury his concern.
"And so 'a lost himself quite," continued Mr. Coggan with an impassive face, implying that a true narrative, like time and tide, must run its course and would respect no man. "And as he was coming along in the middle of the night, much afeard and not able to find his way out of the trees nohow, 'a cried out, 'Man alost! Man alost!' A owl in a tree happened to be crying, 'Hoo, hoo, hoo,' as owls do, you know, shepherd." Gabriel nodded. "And Joseph, all in a tremble, said, 'Joseph Poorgrass of Weatherbury, sir.'" "No, no, now that's too much," said the timid man, becoming a man of brazen courage all of a sudden. "I didn't say 'sir.' I'll take my oath I didn't say 'Joseph Poorgrass of Weatherbury, sir.' No, no, what's right is right, and I never said 'sir' to the bird, knowing very well that no man of a gentleman's rank would be hollering there at that time of night. 'Joseph Poorgrass of Weatherbury.' That's every word I said, and I shouldn't have said that if it hadn't been for Keeper Day's metheglin. There, 'twas a merciful thing it ended where it did." The question of which was right being tacitly waived by the company, Jan went on meditatively. "And he's a fearfullest man, bain't you, Joseph? Ay, another time you were lost by Lammindown Gate, weren't you, Joseph?" "I was," replied Poorgrass, as if there were some conditions too serious even for modesty to remember itself under, this being one. "Yes, that were in the middle of the night too. The gate would not open, try how he would, and knowing there was the devil's hand in it, he kneeled down." "Ah," said Joseph, acquiring confidence from the warmth of the fire, the cider, and a perception of the narrative capabilities of the experience alluded to, "my heart died within me that time, but I kneeled down and said the Lord's Prayer, and then the belief right through, and then the Ten Commandments in earnest prayer. But no, the gate wouldn't open, and then went on with dearly beloved brethren, and thinks I, this makes four, and 'tis all I know out of the book, and if this don't do it, nothing will, and I'm a lost man. Well, when I got to saying after me, I rose from my knees and found that the gate would open. Yes, neighbours, the gate opened the same as ever." A meditation on the obvious inference was indulged in by all, and during its continuance each directed his vision into the ash pit, which glowed like a desert in the tropics under a vertical sun, shaping their eyes long and liney, partly because of the light, partly from the depth of the subject discussed. Gabriel broke the silence. "What sort of place is this to live at? And what sort of missus is she to work under?" Gabriel's bosom thrilled gently as he thus slipped under the notice of the assembly the innermost subject of his heart. "We know little of her, nothing. She only showed herself a few days ago. Her uncle was took bad, and the doctor was called with his world-wide skill, but he couldn't save the man. As I take it, she's going to keep on the farm." "That's about the shape o't, I believe," said Jan Coggan. "Ah, 'tis a very good family. I'd as soon be under 'em as under one here and there. Her uncle was a very fair sort of man. Did you know en, shepherd, a bachelor man?" "Not at all." "I used to go to his house a courting my first wife, Charlotte, who was his dairymaid. Well, a very good-hearted man were Farmer Everdene, and I, being a respectable young fellow, was allowed to call and see her, and drink as much ale as I liked, but not to carry away any. Outside of my skin, I mean, of course." "Ah, Jan Coggan, we know your meaning." "And you see, 'twas beautiful ale, and I wished to value his kindness as much as I could, and not to be so ill-mannered as to drink only a thimbleful, which would have been insulting to the man's generosity." "True, Master Coggan, 'twould so," corroborated Mark Clark. "And so I used to eat a lot of salt fish afore going, and then by the time I got there I were as dry as a lime basket. So thoroughly dry that ale would slip down. Ah, 'twould slip down sweet. Happy times, heavenly times. Such lovely drunks as I used to have at that house. You can mind, Jacob. You used to go with me sometimes." I can," said Jacob. "That one too that we had at the Buck's Head on a White Monday was a pretty tipple." "'Twas, but for a wet of the better class, that brought you no nearer to the horned man than you were before you begun. There was none like those in Farmer Everdene's kitchen. Not a single dam allowed. No, not a bare poor one, even at the most cheerful moment when all were blindest. though the good old word of sin thrown in here and there at such times is a great relief to a merry soul." "True," said the maltster. "Nature requires her swearing at regular times, or she's not herself, and unholy exclamations is a necessity of life." "But Charlotte," continued Coggan, "not a word of the sort would Charlotte allow, nor the smallest item of taking in vain. Ah, poor Charlotte! I wonder if she'd had the good fortune to get into heaven when 'a died. But it never was much in luck's way, and perhaps it went downwards after all, poor soul."
"And did any of you know Miss Everdene's father and mother?" inquired the shepherd, who found some difficulty in keeping the conversation in the desired channel.
"I knew 'em a little," said Jacob Smallbury, "but they were townsfolk and didn't live here. They've been dead for years. Father, what sort of people were Mrs.'s father and mother?" "Well," said the maltster, "he wasn't much to look at, but she was a lovely woman. He was fond enough of her as a sweetheart." "Used to kiss her scores and long hundreds of times, so 'twas said," observed Coggan. "He was very proud of her too, when they were married, as I've been told," said the maltster. "Ay," said Coggan, "he admired her so much that he used to light the candle 3 times a night to look at her." "Boundless love! I shouldn't have supposed it in the universe," murmured Joseph Poorgrass, who habitually spoke on a large scale in his moral reflections. "Well, to be sure," said Gabriel. "Oh, 'tis true enough. I know the man and woman both well. Levi Everdene, that was the man's name, sure. Man, sayeth I in my hurry, but he were of a higher circle of life than that. I was a gentleman tailor really, worth scores of pounds, and he became a very celebrated bankrupt 2 or 3 times." "Oh, I thought he was quite a common man," said Joseph. "Oh, no, no. That man failed for heaps of money, hundreds in gold and silver."
The maltster being rather short of breath, Mr. Coggan, after absently scrutinizing a coal which had fallen among the ashes, took up the narrative with a private twirl of his eye.
"Well, now, you'd hardly believe it, but that man, our Miss Everdene's father, was one of the ficklest husbands alive, after a while. Understand, I didn't want to be fickle, but he couldn't help it. The poor fellow were faithful and true enough to her in his wish, but his heart would rove, do what he would. He spoke to me in real tribulation about it once. 'Coggan,' he said, 'I could never wish for a handsomer woman than I've got, but feeling she's ticketed as my lawful wife, I can't help my wicked heart wandering, do what I will.' But alas, I believe he cured it by making her take off her wedding ring and calling her by her maiden name, as they sat together after the shop was shut, and so I would get to fancy she was only a sweetheart and not married to him at all. And as soon as he could thoroughly fancy he was doing wrong and committing the seventh, I got to like her as well as ever, and they lived on a perfect picture of mutual love." "Well, that was a most ungodly remedy," murmured Joseph Poorgrass. "But we ought to feel deep cheerfulness that a happy providence kept it from being any worse. You see, he might have gone the bad road, and given his eyes to unlawfulness entirely. Yes, gross unlawfulness, so to say it." "You see," said Bill Smallbury, "the man's will was to do right, sure enough, but his heart didn't chime in." "He got so much better that he was quite godly in his later years, wasn't he, Jan?" said Joseph Poorgrass. "He got himself confirmed over again in a more serious way, and took to saying 'Amen' almost as loud as the clerk, and he liked to copy comforting verses from the tombstones. He used to hold the money plate at 'Let your light so shine,' and stand godfather to poor little come-by-chance children. And he kept a missionary box on his table, to nab folks unawares when they called. Yeah, and he would box the charity boys' ears, if they laughed in church, till they could hardly stand upright, and do other deeds of piety natural to the saintly inclined." "Ay, and at that time he thought of nothing but high things," added Billy Smallbury. "One day Parson Thirdly met him and said, 'Good morning, Mr. Everdene, 'tis a fine day.' 'Amen,' said Everdene, quite absent like, thinking only of religion when he see the parson. Yet he was a very Christian man." "Their daughter was not at all a pretty child at that time," said Henery Fray. "Never should have thought she'd have growed up such a handsome body as she is." "'Tis to be hoped her temper's as good as her face." "Well, yes, but the bailie'll have most to do with the business than ourselves. Ah!" Henery gazed in the ash-pit and smiled volumes of ironical knowledge. "A queer Christian, like a devil's head in a cowl. as the saying is," volunteered Mark Clark. Footnote: This phrase is a conjectural emendation of the unintelligible expression, "as the devil said to the owl," used by the natives. End of footnote. "He is," said Henery, implying that irony must cease at a certain point. "Between we two, man and man, I believe that man would as soon tell a lie on Sundays as working days. That I do." "Good faith, you do talk," said Gabriel. "True enough," said the man of bitter moods, looking round upon the company with the antithetic laughter that comes from a keener appreciation of the miseries of life than ordinary men are capable of. "Ha ha! There's people of one sort and people of another, but that man, bless your souls!" Gabriel thought fit to change the subject. "You must be a very aged man, malter, to have sons growed mild and ancient," he remarked. "Father's so old that I can't mind his age, can he, father?" interposed Jacob. "And he's growed terrible crooked too lately," Jacob continued, surveying his father's figure, which was rather more bowed than his own. "Really, one may say that father there is three double." "Crooked folk will last a long while," said the maltster, grimly, and not in the best humour. "Shepherd would like to hear the pedigree of your life, father, wouldn't ye, shepherd?" "Ay, that I should," said Gabriel, with the heartiness of a man who had longed to hear it for several months. "What may your age be, malter?" The maltster cleared his throat in an exaggerated form for emphasis, and, elongating his gaze to the remotest point of the ash pit, said, in the slow speech justifiable when the importance of a subject is so generally felt that any mannerism must be tolerated in getting at it. "Well, I don't mind the year I were born in, but perhaps I can reckon up the places I've lived at, and so get it that way. I bode at Upper Longpuddle, across there," nodding to the north, "till I were 11. Bode 7 at Kingsbere," nodding to the east, "where I took to malting. I went therefrom to Norcombe, and malted there 22 years, and 22 years I was there turnip hoeing and harvesting. Ah, I know that old place Norcombe years afore you were thought of, Master Oak." Oak smiled sincere belief in the fact. "Then I malted at Durnover 4 years, and 4 year turnip hoeing. And I was 14 times 11 months at Millpond St. Jude's," nodding north-west by north. "Old Twills wouldn't hire me for more than 11 months at a time to keep me from being chargeable to the parish, if so be I was disabled. Then I was 3 years at Mellstock, and I've been here 31 year come Candlemas. Now how much is that?" "117," chuckled another old gentleman given to mental arithmetic and little conversation, who had hitherto sat unobserved in a corner. "Well, then, that's my age," said the maltster emphatically. "Oh, no, father," said Jacob. "Your turnip hoeing were in the summer and your malting in the winter of the same years, and we don't ought to count both halves, father." "Chock it all, I lived through the summers, didn't I? That's my question. I suppose you'll say next I'll be no age at all to speak of." "Sure we shan't," said Gabriel soothingly. "You be a very old aged person, malter," attested Jan Coggan, also soothingly. "We all know that, and you must have a wonderful talented constitution to be able to live so long, mustn't ye, neighbours?" "True, true, you must, maltster, wonderful," said the meeting unanimously. The maltster, being now pacified, was even generous enough to voluntarily disparage in a slight degree the virtue of having lived a great many years, by mentioning that the cup they were drinking out of was 3 years older than he. While the cup was being examined, the end of Gabriel Oak's flute became visible over his smock-frock pocket, and Henery Fray exclaimed, "Surely, shepherd, I seed you blowing into a great flute by now at Casterbridge." "You did," said Gabriel, blushing faintly. "I've been in great trouble, neighbours, and was driven to it. I used not to be so poor as I be now." "Never mind, heart," said Mark Clark. "You should take it careless like, shepherd, and your time will come. But we could thank ye for a tune, if ye bain't too tired." "Neither drum nor trumpet have I heard since Christmas," said Jan Coggan. "Come, raise a tune, Master Oak." "Ah, that I will," said Gabriel, pulling out his flute and putting it together. "A poor tool, neighbours, but such as I can do ye shall have and welcome." Oak then struck up "Jockey to the Fair," and played that sparkling melody 3 times through, accenting the notes in the third round, in a most artistic and lively manner by bending his body in small jerks and tapping with his foot to beat time. "He can blow the flute very well, that 'a can," said a young married man, who, having no individuality worth mentioning, was known as Susan Tall's husband. He continued, "I'd as lief as not be able to blow a flute as well as that." "He's a clever man, and 'tis true comfort for us to have such a shepherd," murmured Joseph Poorgrass in a soft cadence. "We ought to feel full of thanksgiving that he's not a player of bawdy songs instead of these merry tunes, for 'twould have been just as easy for God to have made the shepherd a loose, low man, a man of iniquity, so to speak, as what he is. Yes, for our wives' and daughters' sakes we should feel real thanksgiving." "True, true, real thanksgiving," dashed in Mark Clark conclusively, not feeling it to be of any consequence to his opinion that he had only heard about a word and three-quarters of what Joseph had said. "Yes," added Joseph, beginning to feel like a man in the Bible, "for evil do thrive so in these times, that ye may be as much deceived in the cleanest shaved and whitest shirtedest man as in the raggedest tramp on the turnpike, if I may term it so." "Ah, I can mind your face now, shepherd," said Henery Fray, criticizing Gabriel with misty eyes as he entered upon his second tune. "Yes, now I see 'ee blowing into the flute, I know 'ee to be the same man I see playing at Casterbridge, for your mouth were scrimped up and your eyes a staring out like a strangleman's, just as they be now." "'Tis a pity that playing the flute should make a man look such a scarecrow," observed Mr. Mark Clark, with additional criticism of Gabriel's countenance, the latter person jerking out, with the ghastly grimace required by the instrument, the chorus of Dame Durden. "'Twas Moll and Beth and Doll and Kate and Dorothy Draggletail." "I hope you don't mind that young man's bad manners in naming your features," whispered Joseph to Gabriel. "Not at all," said Mr. Oak. "For by nature ye be very a handsome man, shepherd," continued Joseph Poorgrass, with winning suavity. "Ah, that ye be, shepherd," said the company. "Thank you very much," said Oak in the modest tone good manners demanded, thinking, however, that he would never let Bathsheba see him playing the flute. In this resolve showing a discretion equal to that related to its sagacious inventress, the divine Minerva herself. "Ah, when I and my wife were married at Norcombe Church," said the old maltster, not pleased at finding himself left out of the subject, "we were called the handsomest couple in the neighbourhood. Everybody said so." "Danged if you bain't holler now, malter," said a voice with the vigour natural to the enunciation of a remarkably evident truism. It came from the old man in the background, whose offensiveness and spiteful ways were barely atoned for by the occasional chuckle he contributed to general laughs. "Oh, no, no," said Gabriel. "Don't you play no more, shepherd," said Susan Tall's husband, the young married man who had spoken once before. "I must be moving, and when there's tunes going on I seem as if hung on wires. If I thought after I'd left that music was still playing, and I not there, I should be quite melancholy like." "What's your hurry then, Laban?" inquired Coggan. "You used to bide as late as the latest." "Well, you see, neighbours, I was lately married to a woman, and she's my vocation now, and so you see—" The young man halted lamely. "New lords, new laws, as the saying is, I suppose," remarked Coggan. "Ah, I believe," said Susan Tall's husband, in a tone intended to imply his habitual reception of jokes without minding them at all. The young man then wished him good night and withdrew. Henry Fray was the first to follow. Then Gabriel arose and went off with Jan Coggan, who had offered him a lodging. A few minutes later, when the remaining ones were on their legs and about to depart, Fray came back again in a hurry. Flourishing his finger ominously, he threw a gaze teeming with tidings, just where his eye alighted by accident, which happened to be in Joseph Poorgrass's face. "Oh, what's the matter? What's the matter, Henry?" said Joseph, starting back. "What's a brewing, Henry?" asked Jacob and Mark Clark. "Bailey Pennyways, Bailey Pennyways. I said so. Yes, I said so." "What, found out stealing anything?" "Stealing it is. The news is that after Miss Everdene got home she went out again to see all was safe, as she usually do, and coming in found Bailey Pennyways creeping down the granary steps with half a bushel of barley. She fleed at him like a cat. Never such a tomboy as she is. Of course, I speak with closed doors." You do, Henery."
She fleed at him, and to cut a long story short, he owned to having carried off 5 sack altogether, upon her promising not to prosecute him. Well, he's turned out neck and crop, and my question is, who's going to be baily now?" The question was such a profound one that Henery was obliged to drink there and then from the large cup till the bottom was distinctly visible inside. Before he had replaced it on the table, in came the young man, Susan Tall's husband, in a still greater hurry. "Have you heard the news that's all over parish?" "About Bailey Pennyways?" "But besides that?" "No, not a morsel of it," they replied, looking into the very midst of Laban Tall as if to meet his words half-way down his throat. "What a night of horrors!" murmured Joseph Poorgrass, waving his hand spasmodically. "I've had the news bell ringing in my left ear quite bad enough for a murder, and I've seen a magpie all alone. Fanny Robin, Miss Everdene's youngest servant, can't be found. They've been wanting to lock up the doors these 2 hours, but she isn't come in, and they don't know what to do about going to bed for fear of locking her out. They wouldn't be so concerned if she hadn't been noticed in such low spirits these last few days. And Mary Ann to think the beginning of a crowner's inquest has happened to the poor girl." "Ah, 'tis burned, 'tis burned!" came from Joseph Poorgrass's dry lips. "No, 'tis drowned," said Tall. "Or 'tis her father's razor," suggested Bill Smallbury, with a vivid sense of detail. "Well, Miss Everdene wants to speak to one or two of us before we go to bed. What with this trouble about the baily, and now about the girl, missus is almost wild." They all hastened up the lane to the farmhouse, excepting the old maltster, whom neither news, fire, rain, nor thunder could draw from his hole. There, as the other's footsteps died away, he sat down again, and continued gazing as usual into the furnace with his red, bleared eyes. From the bedroom window above their heads, Bathsheba's head and shoulders, robed in mystic white, were dimly seen extended into the air. "Are any of my men among you?" she said anxiously. "Yes, ma'am, several," said Susan Tall's husband. "Tomorrow morning I wish 2 or 3 of you to make inquiries in the villages round if they have seen such a person as Fanny Robin. Do it quietly, there's no reason for alarm as yet. She must have left whilst we were all at the fire." "Beg your pardon, but had she any young man courting her in the parish, ma'am?" asked Jacob Smallbury. "I don't know," said Bathsheba. "I never heard any such thing, ma'am," said 2 or 3. "It is hardly likely either," continued Bathsheba, "for any lover of hers might have come to the house if he had been a respectable lad. The most mysterious matter connected with her absence, indeed the only thing which gives me serious alarm, is that she was seen to go out of the house by Mary Ann with only her indoor working gown on, and not even a bonnet." "And you mean, ma'am, excusing my words, that a young woman would hardly go to see a young man without dressing up," said Jacob, turning his mental vision upon past experiences. "That's true, she would not, ma'am." "She had, I think, a bundle, though I couldn't see very well," said a female voice from another window, which seemed that of Mary Ann. "But she had no young man about here. Hers lives in Casterbridge, and I believe he's a soldier." "Do you know his name?" Bathsheba said. "No, mistress. She was very close about it." "Perhaps I might be able to find out if I went to Casterbridge barracks," said William Smallbury. "Very well. If she doesn't return tomorrow, mind you go there and try to discover which man it is, and see him. I feel more responsible than I should if she had had any friends or relations alive. I do hope she has come to no harm through a man of that kind. And then there's this disgraceful affair of the bailiff, but I can't speak of him now." Bathsheba had so many reasons for uneasiness that it seemed she did not think it worth while to dwell upon any particular one. "Do as I told you, then," she said in conclusion, closing the casement. "Ay, ay, missus, we will," they replied, and moved away. That night at Coggan's, Gabriel Oak, beneath the screen of closed eyelids, was busy with fancies, and full of movement, like a river flowing rapidly under its ice. Night had always been the time at which he saw Bathsheba most vividly, and through the slow hours of shadow he tenderly regarded her image now. It is rarely that the pleasures of the imagination will compensate for their pain of sleeplessness, but they possibly did with Oak tonight, for the delight of merely seeing her effaced for the time his perception of the great difference between seeing and possessing. He also thought of plans for fetching his few utensils and books from Norcombe.
the young man's best companion, the farrier's sure guide, the veterinary surgeon, Paradise Lost, the Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, Ash's Dictionary, and Wilkingame's Arithmetic constituted his library, and though a limited series, it was one from which he had acquired more sound information by diligent perusal than many a man of opportunities has done from a furlong of laden shelves. End of chapter 8.
Far from the madding crowd. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tadhg Hynes. Far from the madding crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 9. The Homestead. A Visitor. Half Confidences. By daylight the bower of Oak's new-found mistress, Bathsheba Everdene, presented itself as a hoary building of the early stage of classic Renaissance as regards its architecture, and of a proportion which told at a glance that, as is so frequently the case, it had once been the memorial hall upon a small estate around it, now altogether effaced as a distinct property, and merged in the vast tract of a non-resident landlord, which comprised several such modest domains. Fluted pilasters, worked from the solid stone, decorated its front, and above the roof the chimneys were panelled or columnar, some coped gables with finials and like features still retaining traces of their Gothic extraction. Soft brown mosses, like faded velveteen, formed cushions upon the stone tiling, and tufts of the houseleek or sengreen sprouted from the eaves of the low surrounding buildings. A gravel walk, leading from the door to the road in front, was encrusted at the sides with more moss. Here it was a silver-green variety, the nut-brown of the gravel being visible to a width of only a foot or two in the centre. This circumstance, and the generally sleepy air of the whole prospect here, together with the animated and contrasting state of the reverse façade, suggested to the imagination that on the adaptation of the building for farming purposes the vital principle of the house had turned round inside its body to face the other way. Reversals of this kind, strange deformities, tremendous paralyses, are often seen to be inflicted by trade upon edifices, either individual or in the aggregate, as streets and towns, which were originally planned for pleasure alone. Lively voices were heard this morning in the upper rooms, the main staircase to which was of hard oak, the balusters, heavy as bedposts, being turned and moulded in the quaint fashion of their century, the handrail as stout as a parapet top, and the stairs themselves continually twisting round like a person trying to look over his shoulder. Going up, the floors above were found to have a very irregular surface, rising to ridges, sinking into valleys, and being just then uncarpeted, the face of the boards was seen to be eaten into innumerable vermiculations. Every window replied by a clang to the opening and shutting of every door. A tremble followed every bustling movement, and a creak accompanied a walker about the house like a spirit wherever he went. In the room from which the conversation proceeded, Bathsheba and her servant companion, Liddy Smallbury, were to be discovered sitting upon the floor, and sorting a complication of papers, books, bottles, and rubbish spread out thereon, remnants of the household stores of the late occupier. Liddy, the maltster's great-granddaughter, was about Bathsheba's equal in age, and her face was a prominent advertisement of the light-hearted English country girl. The beauty her features might have lacked in form was amply made up for by perfection of hue, which at this winter time was the softened ruddiness on a surface of high rotundity that we meet with in a Terburg or a Gerard Dow, and, like the presentations of these great colourists, it was a face which kept well back from the boundary between comeliness and the ideal. Though elastic in nature, she was less daring than Bathsheba, and occasionally showed some earnestness, which consisted half of genuine feeling and half of mannerliness superadded by way of duty. Through a partly open door the noise of a scrubbing brush led up to the charwoman, Mary Ann Money, a person who for a face had a circular disc, furrowed less by age than by long gazes of perplexity at distant objects. To think of her was to get good-humoured. To speak of her was to raise the image of a dried Normandy pippin. "Stop your scrubbing a moment," said Bathsheba through the door to her. "I hear something." Mary Ann suspended the brush. The tramp of a horse was apparent, approaching the front of the building. The paces slackened, turned in at the wicket, and, what was most unusual, came up the mossy path close to the door. The door was tapped with the end of a crop or stick.
"What impertinence," said Liddy in a low voice, "to ride up the footpath like that. Why didn't he stop at the gate? Lord, 'tis a gentleman. I see the top of his hat."
"Be quiet," said Bathsheba. The further expression of Liddy's concern was continued by aspect instead of narrative.
"Why doesn't Mrs. Coggan go to the door?" Bathsheba continued.
Rat-tat-tat-tat resounded more decisively from Bathsheba's oak.
"Maryann, you go,"
she said, fluttering under the onset of a crowd of romantic possibilities.
"Oh, ma'am, see, here's a mess."
The argument was unanswerable after a glance at Maryann.
"Liddy, you must," said Bathsheba.
Liddy held up her hands and arms coated with dust from the rubbish they were sorting, and looked imploringly at her mistress.
"There, Mrs. Coggan is going," said Bathsheba, exhaling her relief in the form of a long breath which had lain in her bosom a minute or more.
The door opened, and a deep voice said, "Is Miss Everdene at home?" "I'll see, sir," said Mrs. Coggan, and in a minute appeared in the room.
"Dear, what a third over place this world is," continued
Mrs. Coggan, a wholesome-looking lady who had a voice for each class of remark according to the emotion involved, who could toss a pancake or twirl a mop with the accuracy of pure mathematics, and who at this moment showed hands shaggy with fragments of dough and arms encrusted with flour.
"I'm never up to my elbows, miss, in making a pudding, but one of two things do happen. Either my nose must needs begin tickling, and I can't live without scratching it, or somebody knocks at the door. Here's Mr. Boldwood wanting to see you, Miss Everdene."
A woman's dress being a part of her countenance, and any disorder in one being of the same nature with a malformation or wound in the other, Bathsheba said at once,
"I can't see him in this state. Whatever shall I do?"
Not at homes were hardly naturalized in Weatherbury farmhouses, so Liddy suggested,
"Say you're a fright with dust and you can't come down."
"Yes, that sounds very well," said Mrs. Coggan critically. "Say I can't see him. That will do." Mrs. Coggan went downstairs and returned the answer as requested, adding, however, on her own responsibility,
"Miss is dusting bottles, sir, and is quite a object. That's why 'tis."
"Oh, very well," said a deep voice indifferently. "All I wanted to ask was if anything had been heard of Fanny Robin."
"Nothing, sir, but we may know to-night. William Smallbury has gone to Casterbridge, where our young man lives, as is supposed, and the other men be inquiring about everywhere." The horse's tramp then recommenced and retreated, and the door closed. "Who is Mr. Boldwood?" said Bathsheba. "A gentleman farmer at Little Weatherbury."
"Married?"
"No, miss."
"How old is he?"
40, I should say. Very handsome. Rather stern-looking and rich. What a bother this dusting is! I am always in some unfortunate plight or other," said Bathsheba complainingly. "Why should he inquire about Fanny?" "Oh, because as she had no friends in her childhood, he took her and put her to school, and got her a place here under your uncle. He's a very kind man that way, but Lord, there!"
"What?"
"Never was such a hopeless man for a woman. He's been courted by sixes and sevens. All the girls, gentle and simple, for miles around have tried him. Jane Perkins worked at him for 2 months, like a slave. And the two Miss Taylors spent a year upon him, and he cost Farmer Ives's daughter nights of tears and £20 worth of new clothes. But Lord, the money might as well have been thrown out of the window."
A little boy came up at this moment and looked in upon them. This child was one of the Coggans, who, with the Smallburys, were as common among the families of the district as the Avons and Derwents among our rivers. He always had a loosened tooth or a cut finger to show to particular friends, which he did with an air of being thereby elevated above the common herd of affectionate humanity, to which exhibition people were expected to say, "Poor child," with a dash of congratulations as well as pity.
"I've got a penny," said Master Coggan in a scanning measure.
"Well, who gave it to you, Teddy?" said Liddy.
"Mr. Boldwood. He gave it to me for opening the gate."
"What did he say?"
"He said, 'Where are you going, my little man?' And I said, 'To Miss Everdene's, please.' And he said, 'She's a staid woman, isn't she, my little man?' And I said, 'Yes.'"
"You naughty child! What did you say that for?"
'Cause you gave me the penny." "What a pucker everything is in," said Bathsheba discontentedly when the child had gone. "Get away, Maryann, or go on with your scrubbing, or do something. You ought to be married by this time, and not here troubling me." "Ah, mistress, so I did. But what between the poor men I won't have, and the rich men who won't have me, I stand as a pelican in the wilderness." "Did anybody ever want to marry you, miss?" Liddy ventured to ask when they were again alone. "Lots of 'em, I dare say." Bathsheba paused, as if about to refuse a reply, but the temptation to say yes, since it was really in her power, was irresistible by aspiring virginity, in spite of her spleen at having been published as old. "A man wanted to once," she said in a highly experienced tone, and the image of Gabriel Oak, as the farmer, rose before her. "How nice it must seem," said Liddy, with the fixed features of mental realization. "And you wouldn't have him?" "He wasn't quite good enough for me." "How sweet to be able to disdain, when most of us are glad to say, 'Thank you.' I seem to hear it. 'No, sir, I'm your better,' or 'Kiss my foot, sir, my face is for mouths of consequence.' And did you love him, miss?" "Oh, no, but I rather liked him." "Do you now?" "Of course not. What footsteps are those I hear?" Liddy looked from a back window into the courtyard behind, which was now getting low-toned and dim with the earliest films of night. A crooked file of men was approaching the back door, the whole string of trailing individuals advanced in the completest balance of intention, like the remarkable creatures known as chained salpæ, which, distinctly organized in other aspects, have one will common to a whole family. Some were, as usual, in snow-white smock frocks of Russian duck, and some in whitey-brown ones of drabbet, marked on the wrists, breasts, backs, and sleeves with honeycomb work. Two or three women in pattens brought up the rear. "The Philistines be upon us," said Liddy, making her nose white against the glass. "Oh, very well. Maryann, go down and keep them in the kitchen till I am dressed, and then show them in to me in the hall." End of chapter 9. Far from the madding crowd. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tadhg Hynes. Far from the madding crowd, by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 10. Mistress and Men. Half an hour later, Bathsheba, in finished dress, and followed by Liddy, entered the upper end of the old hall to find that her men had all deposited themselves on a long form and a settle at the lower extremity. She sat down at a table and opened the time-book, pen in her hand, with a canvas money-bag beside her. From this she poured a small heap of coin. Liddy chose a position at her elbow and began to sew, sometimes pausing and looking round, or, with the air of a privileged person, taking up one of the half-sovereigns lying before her and surveying it merely as a work of art, while strictly preventing her countenance from expressing any wish to possess it as money. "Now, before I begin, men," said Bathsheba, "I have two matters to speak of. The first is that the bailiff is dismissed for thieving, and that I have formed a resolution to have no bailiff at all, but to manage everything with my own head and hands." The men breathed an audible breath of amazement. "The next matter is, have you heard anything of Fanny?" "Nothing, ma'am." "Have you done anything?" "I met Farmer Boldwood," said Jacob Smallbury, "and I went with him and two of his men and dragged New Mill Pond, but we found nothing." "And the new shepherd have been to Buck's Head at Yalbury, thinking she had gone there, but nobody had seen her," said Laban Tall. "Hasn't William Smallbury been to Casterbridge?" "Yes, ma'am, but he's not yet come home. He promised to be back by 6." "It wants 6:15 at present," said Bathsheba, looking at her watch. "I dare say he'll be in directly. Well, now then." She looked into the book. "Joseph Poorgrass, are you there?" "Yes, sir. Ma'am, I mean," said the person addressed. "I be the personal name of Poorgrass." "And what are you?" "Nothing in my own eye. In the eye of other people, well, I don't say it, though public thought will out." "What do you do on the farm?" I do carting things all the year, and in seed time I shoots the rooks and sparrows, and helps at pig killing, sir."
"How much to you?"
"Please, it's 9 and 9pence, and a good halfpenny where 'twas a bad one, sir. Ma'am, I mean."
"Quite correct. Now, here are 10 shillings in addition as a small present, as I am a newcomer." Bathsheba blushed slightly at the sense of being generous in public, and Henery Fray, who had drawn up towards her chair, lifted his eyebrows and fingers to express amazement on a small scale. "How much do I owe you? That man in the corner, what's your name?" continued Bathsheba.
"Matthew Moon, ma'am,"
said a singular framework of clothes with nothing of any consequence inside them, which advanced with the toes in no definite direction forward, but turned in or out as they chanced to swing. "Matthew Mark, did you say? Speak out, I shall not hurt you," inquired the young farmer kindly.
"Matthew Moon, ma'am,"
said Henery Fray correctingly from behind her chair, to which point he had edged himself. "Matthew Moon," murmured Bathsheba, turning her bright eyes to the book. 10 and 2pence halfpenny is the sum put down to you, I see."
"Yes, missus," said Matthew, as the rustle of wind among dead leaves.
"Here it is, and 10 shillings. Now, the next, Andrew Randall. You are a new man, I hear. How came you to leave your last farm?"
Please, ma'am, please, ma'am, please, ma'am."
"As a stammering man, ma'am," said Henery Fray in an undertone. "And they turned him away, because the only time he ever did speak plain, he said his soul was his own, and other iniquities, to the squire. I can cuss, ma'am, as well as you or I, but I can't speak a common speech to save his life. Andrew Randall, here's yours. Finish thanking me in a day or two. Temperance Miller. Oh, here's another. Soberness. Both women, I suppose."
"Yes, ma'am, here we be, I believe,"
was echoed in shrill unison. "And what have you been doing?"
"Tending threshing machine and wimbling hay-bonds, and saying hoosh to the cocks and hens when they go upon your seeds, and planting early flower balls and Thompson's wonderfuls with a dibble."
"Yes, I see. Are they satisfactory women?" she inquired softly of Henery Fray.
"Oh, ma'am, don't ask me. Yielding women, as scarlet as pear as ever was," groaned Henery under his breath.
"Sit down."
"Who, ma'am?"
"Sit down." Joseph Poorgrass in the background twitched, and his lips became dry with fear of some terrible consequences, as he saw Bathsheba summarily speaking, and Henery slinking off to a corner. "Now, the next. Laban Tall, you'll stay on working for me?"
"For you or anybody that pays me well, ma'am,"
replied the young married man.
"True, the man must live,"
said a woman in the back quarter, who had just entered with clicking pattens. "What woman is that?" Bathsheba asked.
"I be his lawful wife,"
continued the voice with greater prominence of manner and tone. This lady called herself 25, looked 30, passed for 35, and was 40. She was a woman who never, like some newly married, showed conjugal tenderness in public, perhaps because she had none to show. "Oh, you are," said Bathsheba. "Well, Laban, will you stay on?"
"Yes, he'll stay, ma'am,"
said again the shrill tongue of Laban's lawful wife. "Well, he can speak for himself, I suppose?"
"Oh, Lord, not he, ma'am. A simple tool. Well enough, but a poor gawkhammer mortal," the wife replied.
"He, he, he, he!" laughed the married man with a hideous effort of appreciation, for he was as irrepressibly good-humoured under ghastly snubs as a parliamentary candidate on the hustings. The names remaining were called in the same manner. "Now, I think I have done with you," said Bathsheba, closing the book and shaking back a stray twine of hair. "Has William Smallbury returned?"
"No, ma'am."
"The new shepherd will want a man under him," suggested Henery Fray, trying to make himself official again by his sideways approach towards her chair. "Oh, he will. Who can he have?"
"Young Cain Ball's a very good lad," Henery said. "And Shepherd Oak don't mind his youth," he added, turning with an apologetic smile to the shepherd, who had just appeared on the scene and was now leaning against the doorpost with his arms folded.
"No, I don't mind that," said Gabriel.
"How did Cain come by such a name?" asked Bathsheba. "Ah, you see, ma'am, his poor mother, not being a scripture-read woman, made a mistake at his christening, thinking 'twas Abel killed Cain, and called him Cain, meaning Abel all the time. The parson put it right, but 'twas too late, for the name could never be got rid of in the parish. 'Tis very unfortunate for the boy." "It is rather unfortunate." "Yes. However, we soften it down as much as we can, and call him Cainy. Ah, poor widow woman! She cried her heart out about it almost. She was brought up by a very heathen father and mother, who never sent her to church or school, and it shows how the sins of the parents are visited upon the children, ma'am." Mr. Fray here drew up his features to the mild degree of melancholy required when the persons involved in the given misfortune do not belong to your own family. "Very well, then. Cainy Ball to be under shepherd. And you quite understand your duties, you, I mean, Gabriel Oak?" "Quite well, I thank you, Miss Everdene," said Shepherd Oak from the door-post. "If I don't, I'll inquire." Gabriel was rather staggered by the remarkable coolness of her manner. Certainly nobody without previous information would have dreamt that Oak and the handsome woman before whom he stood had ever been other than strangers. But perhaps her air was the inevitable result of the social rise which had advanced her from a cottage to a large house and fields. The case is not unexampled in high places. When, in the writings of the later poets, Jove and his family were found to have moved from their cramped quarters on the peak of Olympus into the wide sky above it, their words show a proportionate increase of arrogance and reserve. Footsteps were heard in the passage, combining in their character the qualities both of weight and measure, rather at the expense of velocity. All. "Here's Billy Smallbury, come from Casterbridge." "And what's the news?" said Bathsheba, as William, after marching to the middle of the hall, took a handkerchief from his hat and wiped his forehead from its centre to the remoter boundaries. "I should have been sooner, miss," he said, "if I hadn't been for the weather." He then stamped with each foot severely, and on looking down his boots were perceived to be clogged with snow. "Come at last, is it?" said Henery. "Well, what about Fanny?" said Bathsheba. "Well, ma'am, in round numbers she's run away with the soldiers," said William. "No, not a steady girl like Fanny." "I'll tell ye all particulars. When I got to Casterbridge barracks they said the 11th Dragoon Guards be gone away and new troops have come. The 11th left last week for Melchester and onwards. The route came from the government like a thief in the night, as is his nature to do, and afore the 11th knew it almost, they were on the march. They passed near here." Gabriel had listened with interest. "I saw them go," he said. "Yes," continued William, "they pranced down the street playing 'The Girl I Left Behind Me,' so 'tis said, in glorious notes of triumph. Every looker-on's inside shook with the blows of the great drum to his deepest vitals, and there was not a dry eye throughout the town among the public-house people and the nameless women." "But they're not gone to any war?" "No, ma'am, but they be gone to take the places of them who may, which is very close connected. And so I said to myself, Fanny's young man was one of the regiment, and she's gone after him. There, ma'am, that's it in black and white." "Did you find out his name?" "No, nobody knew it. I believe he was higher in rank than a private." Gabriel remained musing and said nothing, for he was in doubt. "Well, we are not likely to know more to-night, at any rate," said Bathsheba. "But one of you had better run across to Farmer Boldwood's and tell him that much." She then rose, but before retiring addressed a few words to them with a pretty dignity, to which her mourning dress added a soberness that was hardly to be found in the words themselves. "Now, mind you have a mistress instead of a master. I don't know yet my powers or my talents in farming, but I shall do my best, and if you serve me well, so shall I serve you. Don't any unfair ones among you, if there are any such, but I hope not, suppose that because I am a woman I don't understand the difference between bad goings-on and good." All. "Know him." Liddy. "Excellent well said." "I shall be up before you are awake, I shall be afield before you are up, and I shall have breakfasted before you are afield. In short, I shall astonish you all." All. "Yes'm." "And so good night." All. "Good night, ma'am." Then this small thesmothete stepped from the table and surged out of the hall, her black silk dress licking up a few straws and dragging them along with a scratching noise upon the floor. Liddy, elevating her feelings to the occasion from a sense of grandeur, floated off behind Bathsheba with a milder dignity not entirely free from travesty, and the door was closed. End of chapter 10.